figured out. I never knew what a complementary color was, for example. So I was figuring that out, kind of, I guess, through trusting my eyes in a sense, because it was very much a make work then be critiqued sort of way of practicing. So that's how I was kind of operating, you know, failing, 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 I think. So if we go to slide number 5, in coming up to my final year, I went on one of these field trips that we used to do, which were great, a great way of getting out of the studio really and collecting source material. But I decided I would take huge rolls of canvas outside and just see what happened, and try to introduce color a bit more. So this is a shot of a piece on the ground, and I would work on them for about a week. These are about 13 or 14 feet wide by about 8 or 9 feet high, as big as canvas as I could get. And they were primed in the studio beforehand with rabbit skin glue, which some of you might know is a sort of almost like a jelly-like material that you heat up and then you apply it to a canvas. It's a way of sizing the canvas, you know, in case you were putting oil paint on it, which I wasn't, but I was interested in the flat surface I could get. And I found it really interesting when I was working outside. I was able to, once it started to rain, I was able to sort of etch through the rabbit skin glue. I was using about 13 layers, so I was very interested in sort of, even though something flat like a painting, it can absorb quite a lot of materials over time. And even when I was working outside in the rain, I quite liked the way I could etch pigment and charcoal and graphite into the surface. But also I found it really interesting with canvas in particular, the way I could stain it from the back, and that became really important. And I often found there was things like oxides in the ground which would sort of cause almost like these kind of flashes of red throughout the painting, almost like spores. And I was doing things like putting the canvas in waterfalls overnight, and this was in southwest Kerry, when I was coming, I think it was in one of my final year. So it was these large kind of tarpaulin type paintings. And if you go into slide 6, I was looking a lot at people like, this is Morris Lewis. I was quite interested in the way that he would stain paint onto large surfaces of canvas, but he would do so in a way that he was almost removing his hand, in a sense that you just tilt the canvas and pour the paint on, diluted acrylic paint. And I liked the way that, I think it was Clement Greenberg or Michael Fried wrote about his paintings, that the color was not on top of a surface, it was actually inside the substrate. It was actually inside, it was kind of nowhere to be seen and everywhere to be seen. It was just curious sort of, I guess it was hard to locate exactly where the color was. And if you've seen these in the flesh, they do a very strange optical sort of a hovering quality to them, and they're quite large as well. They are color-filled paintings. And he was coming out of people like Helen Frankenthaler at the time in New York. He was kind of a recluse living out, I think, in Washington at the time. But quite interesting, sort of semi-uncelebrated painter. But anyway, I was looking at him at the time. I was also making, if you go to slide number 7, these small little collages. And again, I was trying to find ways to absorb them into the large works. And I was getting images from the internet. I mean, like everyone does. I mean, Google Images was sort of taking off then. This is in 2007. So I was taking encyclopedias, whatever I could get my hands on to get images, and kind of slamming them together. So this is just a collage of a globe from an encyclopedia with a drawing of from an advertisement that I found in a Sunday newspaper for I think gazebos or kind of a patio or something like that. But through pushing it through a particular medium and having graph paper that it was on, it gave it a different kind of a quality. So if you go into slide number 8, this is another example where I was just kind of trying to generate ideas. I guess these were almost like sketchbooks, and they weren't finished pieces in themselves. Just trying to get a rich grouping of sort of sketches and sort of material experiments that then I could take into the paintings. Slide number 9 is another example. I was using all sorts of things like pastels and acrylics and resins and watercolors and etching back into oil pastels. Slide number 10 is another example where I used to prime up a lot of sheets in gesso. It's quite a nice material, some of you might be aware of, to actually draw on. And I would just draw from images. I wouldn't have any sort of a plan for making a painting. You know, a lot of the time I was selecting images almost like trying to not dodge meaning, but sort of trying to create a sort of a way where images might start to cancel each other out, and that's something I'll come back to. If you go to slide number 11, this was one of the first paintings that kind of came up to the end of my degree show at the time, which was kind of an aha moment in a sense, because I had been making these very large pieces that were about 10 feet wide, and then I just decided to do a small version. And when I took the small version inside and I stretched it on a canvas stretcher, and it sort of knocked off a lot of the paint around the outside of the actual painting, and it kind of gave it a parchment type look. And I found that when I painted something sort of from a smaller image that I had on top of it, you can see the chair playing in the bottom right, and there's a bucket of fish I think in the top left. It sort of created a very sort of quick and easy kind of figure-ground relationship. There was sort of one language in the background, which was the almost Gerhard Richter looking squeegee sort of painting, and then there was this sort of detailed sort of brightly coloured acrylic painting on top, and that I was kind of off then. I just started experimenting with that, and they're also quite small. I kind of like the idea, this number 12, slide number 12, with the kingfisher bird on it. I like the idea that of kind of cramming a small painting with different sort of languages, I guess, and they would start out very kind of loose, and sometimes they would be painted outside, and a lot of washing off paint, and then I would start to gradually add things like there's an Egyptian, I think, burial box that's in the background, and then there's these medals that I found online, and there's a drawing from an etching of Archimedes' Principle. So it's almost putting a kind of a narrative together, but sort of one that starts to fall apart quite quickly if you kind of analyze it on its own without the sort of, I guess, things like color and form, the very formal properties of the paintings. And I quite like the way that these are about a little bit bigger than A4, and when you stood back from them on a typical white cube wall, they did look like an abstract painting to a degree, and when you went close, that shifted and changed. So I like the way that it, because of the size, it could kind of be both, it could almost hint at something abstract while it's being something quite figurative. Slide number 13. This paint, and a lot of the time, these paintings would be coming from sketches, and I would start out with absolutely no preconceived plan. Even when I got to the painting stage, I wouldn't sort of work up to a sketch and then try to make it into a painting. It was very much just to sort of lead me in, and I would just sort of, I mean, it's a tricky question, you know, when is a painting finished in a sense, and it was more when it had a particular tension against a wall, I think, not just what it actually looked like within itself, but I was in a sense trying to avoid a very linear meaning. It was almost giving the viewer the sort of the tools to kind of put together their own story. Slide number 14. I started to bring in figures at the time and sort of playing around with scale quite dramatically with things like figures the same size as a sort of a funfair ride that then together are much smaller than a branch in the background. Slide number 15. I played around with a little bit with introducing a small element of humour into the work, such as a pigeon here wearing a Harry Potter hat against giant flowers growing on top of it. I've sort of done that again in the next slide, number 16. There's a tiny boat in the bottom left-hand corner. So I like the idea that you could, even though a painting was quite small, you could still hide little things inside the painting in quite small details that would sort of shift your reading of the rest of the painting once you noticed them. And that's something I'll come back to with more recent work. Slide number 17, some floating heads. Again, kind of playing with humour as a way to sort of draw the viewer in. Slide number 18, this would have begun as I would have just I copied I think it was a Morris Lewis strip painting or an Ian Davenport sort of process painting. I think I might have copied that at the beginning and kind of allowed myself in a sense to start to fail. Like, how could a small painting of an Ian Davenport painting be any good? That was sort of my way in really to starting this painting. And what happened when each time I would draw one of the vertical lines down into sort of the pink sea in the bottom, it would sort of upset the pink, and I would be bringing layers back from other layers underneath the painting. And I found that it sort of started to resemble something that looked like exhaust fumes from from rockets. So that led me then to try to find some rocket images, and then I started to think about, well, I could put planes in a sort of an image like this, and that's really how an image like this came to be. But I usually try to push it beyond the point where it almost looked like that was something that I meant to do to a degree. So intention and sort of the actual process of making the painting. Where sometimes I tried to keep it within a sort of a playful attitude, I think, because anytime I tried to do something more procedural, it just sort of fell apart. Image number 19. This would again be sort of trying to play around with some things, sort of playing around with narrative, but I was still quite interested in the sort of parchment effect around the outside of the painting, so it almost had a sort of an aged look to it. Slide number 20. I mean, again, going back to a more gestational way of actually generating a painting. Kind of, this painting would have begun with a giant ear in the background, kind of smack in the middle of the painting, and of course that looked terrible when I painted it. And then I decided then to paint a giant blue shape over to wash it out, and then that resembled something like a mountain. And then I started to think about, well, if I had a number of mountains in the painting, little things can go on top of it, and it began to think about a way of constructing a landscape that way. But I was looking a lot of kind of outsider art and sort of primitive, inverted commas, art, and where you get these strange or even illuminated manuscripts, where you get very strange compositions where the eye can't really rest. And that's something that I'm again working with more and more at the moment. Slide number 21. I think the image in the front was from a school play, a photograph I'd taken of, I think some an Oscar Wilde play, then mixing it with some flamingos that I found in another newspaper. I used to get a lot of the images just from picking up the daily newspaper every day and going through it. That was often enough to create a painting out of. If you look at slide number 22 and 23, this gives us sort of an insight into kind of the process of making the painting. So in slide number 22, you can see I started kind of drawing it up with red paint, I think, and then I'm sort of whiting areas out, and in whiting areas out, that's suggesting different things to add to the painting. So if we go to slide number 24, yeah, this is the last sort of painting that I made as I was in my degree show, and I kind of developed a sort of a thing where I would do these sort of scratchy backgrounds and these detailed images on top, and I wanted to sort of break out of that a little bit. So when I left the Crawford College of Art, where I did my undergrad, I just said, what was the most important thing to me when I was making the paintings? What did I enjoy the most? What did I feel like take responsibility for? Which I think is a quite good definition of art in general. And I thought I could take responsibility for the images that I was painting from, rather than the actual we call them scratchy, sort of squeegeed, rictory backgrounds. So if you look at image number 25, I decided I was just going to layer image on top of image, and in a sense, I thought I was trying to kind of push out the slightly twee narrative, which I never really did at this time, and sort of introduce maybe a narrative of the painting's making, almost as if these paintings were meant to look a little bit like as if they were stickers layered on top of each other. So I also shrunk the size. So this is about 17 by 12 centimeters, so it's about postcard size. So I was trying to cram as much information in as I could, and I liked the way that the images almost began to cancel each other out. If you look at slide number 26, this would have just begun as a painting of that little Napoleon, the kid dressed up as Napoleon on the right and the pagoda on the left. And I just kept adding more and more images and adding Sputnik satellite on the right, and there's some of the verticals in the background are taken from Apollo Uccello painting of a battle. I think it's the painting that's in the National Gallery of the Battler Urbino, I think. So I took elements out of that, and I would sort of just keep going until I felt that if one more thing would sort of make the painting collapse. So it almost acted like a mass, kind of edge to edge. Slide number 27, I'm actually painting on, I created like a marble surface in the studio, and then I scanned that and I repainted that. So I was trying to find elements in the paintings that I thought would look good in paint, as well as being something that I thought would add to a very sort of slippery, suggestive narrative, where it was sort of hard to reconcile. I was trying to make the paintings, I guess, intentionally difficult to interpret. Slide number 28. This is a very small painting. It's about 16 centimeters squared, about that. It's just a painting of a bush on top of a Flemish tapestry, I think it is. But you've got these small little elements that are floating around on it. You can see, especially in front of the bush. And what I was doing was I was trying to break up the sort of legibility of the painting. The fact that you could see it was just a bush on top of a painting of a tapestry. And what I was doing is I was taking little images from things like Argos catalogues, things that I thought would look good in the painting, but I had to kind of subtract elements from them in order that they wouldn't sort of take over. But they were sort of almost like little interruptions in the surface to break up the sort of figure versus ground relationship. You can see it again in slide number 29. I've actually painted there was a painting that was in my parents' house of a sort of a stream in a forest, and I took a photograph of that. I repainted it, then I flipped that upside down and painted these cakes on top of the painting. But you do get these small little, they're almost like stickers stuck onto the painting, which are the smaller little elements painted on. Sometimes they're things like knight's armor or bedposts, or sometimes all I do is just flip something upside down, and that was enough that it would be slightly illegible. Slide number 30. I've actually repainted a painting here again. This is, I'm not sure the name of the artist. It's a German artist in the 1500s, and apparently it's one of the first landscape paintings where you get sort of Jesus walking on water over to the apostles, in the middle on the boat, but in the background there's actually German forces fighting, sort of running across on horseback. So it's a kind of an interesting, I thought it was an interesting sort of mix of times within a painting. And I've decided to paint on top of that sort of reproduction I've done, and paint two views of Saint Michel from slightly different perspectives. The idea that you can never really represent something in its totality in painting, but you can kind of play at that. You can play with that sort of that idea. You know, actually just painting something twice. That sort of, I quite liked doing things like that in painting, where you would sort of stand back. I quite like paintings where you stand back and you say, well, why did the artist make that? I'm as interested in that as I am in actually what the story might be told in the painting, as well as the materiality. I find the three need to sort of be working together for me to sort of, well, for me in the studio anyway, to be sustained by it. Number 31, slide 31. I was also, actually, it's funny you say failure, because I've kind of ticked a lot of things that I was thinking about at the time, because I was making these paintings in my studio. They were taking about a month to make each, and I was getting quite sort of, you know, almost like cabin fever making them. I wanted to do something else, maybe something looser like other older work. So I got like 100 sheets of cheap cartridge paper. I got some cheap brushes, cheap paint, and I just started giving myself sort of painting titles to make little sort of very loose paintings about. And sometimes they'd be like a painting of a rock concert or something that couldn't possibly be any good, I thought. But actually I found myself being very loose in making them. They're almost like drawings, coloured drawings as well as paintings. And I don't have any images of them, but I would photograph them and I would take them into Photoshop, and I would twist the colours a little bit and I would shrink them down and I would paint from them. So you can see there's a sort of, on the right of the circular painting in slide number 31, there's an almost blue calligraphic line, and I would that came from a very large sheet of cartridge paper. It was just painting about a fancy 17th century signature, and there's a sort of an all-seeing eye then kind of to the top left quadrant of that painting. So I found I could use these linear elements to try and knit together parts of the painting. Slide number 32. I was kind of playing with I was taking a lot of images again from things like Argos catalogues and from newspapers, which I liked the colour of, but I didn't necessarily like that it was a toy. I didn't want to say paint a toy. I was trying as best I could. I think I was failing anyway, but trying to get away from this idea of kitshness or almost chocolate boxiness. But these little interventions, these little sort of growths on the top left of the painting, the snow sort of scene, there's one just on the right in the top right hand corner, were a way of sort of interrupting that sort of pleasant, idyllic, perhaps sublime snow landscape. I think I've done the same in the next image, number 33. And image number 34, I was taking things like Aurolii from like Duccio paintings from, I think, 1400s. I think he's a Sienese painter in Italy. He would paint these sort of, like, say, like the Virgin Child coming down on the top of a town, but then it would have these very interesting sort of concentric circles, almost like a Kenneth Noland painting, or these kind of, or sort of these kind of wobbly, wavy lines that looked like they were done on a sort of an image editing program rather than in a sort of a workshop in Siena in 1450 or something like that. So I was taking elements like that and putting them into paintings, and doing the rings like that gave me ideas to paint these little, an image in slide number 34, to paint these actual diamond rings. And but I kind of had this, and slide number 35 was sort of a moment where things started to kind of shift, because I was trying to, as much as I could, I was trying to get away from, there was, as you can see, a sort of a slight kitsch nature to the paintings, and I was trying to figure out, as I had done before, what was I really, really interested in? What was I really interested in making? And I wanted to kind of, you know, go from something kind of slightly specific to becoming a little more specific. And I started to get sort of fed up with just using photographic images, and I found that I was always going for the same type of images. But when I questioned that, I realized that the kind of images I liked were actually quite colorful, quite highly saturated images. So I bought some cheap plasticine and just started to make these forms and photograph them in the studio. And when I could twist these forms into any shape I wanted that I thought might help me resolve the painting, and again kind of knitting some of the elements in the painting together. And so I started to paint these pieces of plasticine, and they didn't necessarily look like plasticine, but they could almost kind of almost, I guess, subvert themselves, or kind of insert themselves into the representational scheme of the painting, almost without upsetting it completely. But it would allow me almost to physically intervene with the painting, and I found that quite a rewarding thing to do at the time. I didn't really push it at the time. Slide number 36, I was still making these sort of photographic, I guess, ish sort of paintings of things like mazes, but then these small paintings of smaller little collages that I'd made. I would scan them, and sometimes they'd be quite large collages, about A4 size. I'd shrink them and scan them and paint from them. So these are quite small again. If you go to slide number 37, this is where I kind of made a kind of a break with that work, where I decided that why don't I just make the images that I want to paint rather than having to rely on the newspaper or Google Images. So I started to make these sort of sculptures, and I thought it would be a way for me to work with something that I couldn't really, in a sense I was always going to be failing with it because I didn't know anything about sculpture, but I felt that I was using it for my own means, in a sense, not necessarily to make a beautiful sculpture, but to make something that, once photographed, would be interesting and worthwhile, and could give me kind of sort of something worth painting, basically. So I started to make this painting number 37. It's got one sculpture sort of in the middle. It's got these American flags, so I was still kind of hinting at something sort of that might have been happening in the world at the time. This is 2008, and you've got Obama going for election. There's actually a tiny little sculpture of Obama smack in the middle of the painting. I don't know if you zoom in, but so it was almost like a childish, lovely sort of free way of making these sculptures, which were covering my studio floor. There was plaster and plasticine and varnish and gesso and newspaper scrunched up and dipped in gesso 30 times to make sort of things that looked like moon rocks and bits of self-hardening clay, and but then it had this very sort of this place where I was kind of distilling that, which was in these small paintings. So if you go to slide number 38, I was also working a lot with taking the images and then taking them into Photoshop. So I'd make the sculptures, I'd take a photograph, take it into Photoshop, and I kind of went to town with things like, if anyone knows Photoshop, they can see that I've been overdoing the liquify tool quite a bit, but I quite like that tool in the way that you could stretch the image to make it look like almost like a brush stroke. And I was looking a lot at the time at Jeff Koons and the way that he was repainting actual brush strokes, and I thought this was a real kind of a cat eating its own tail sort of way of making art, you know, using paint to paint itself, kind of a sort of a self-mirroring or something. So I was playing around with that. I mean, a lot of the time I was just interested in getting a sort of a sort of an interesting, I guess with number 38, it's sort of almost like a lilac versus yellow. It's almost like that's what the painting was about. But there are images just about discernible within them. So it's a sort of a floaty sense of confusion, which is kind of what I was interested in making works, I guess, in and around rather than about. Slide number 39. It's actually the same sculpture sort of mirrored on top of itself, so you can see the back and the front, and just these concentric circles on Photoshop. I'm not really sure exactly what these paintings were about, in a sense. It was still playing with that thing where it looked representational, but it looked abstract. It was like a way of, but they were actually incredibly flat. They were painted in acrylic, and I was working almost like a printer, so I would come in on a Monday, and it might take me 3 or 4 days just to do the lemon yellows, and then it might take me 3 or 4 days to do the cadmium yellows, because I would be layering 3 or 4 yellows on top of each other to get a sort of, I find that with acrylics you had to go beyond the plastic finish, and that often took quite a lot of layers to kind of pull off. So I quite liked that it was beginning to be quite jewel-like. These are still quite small. It's about 21 by 16 centimeters. And slide number 40, this is a very small painting. It's fit in your hand. It's about 10 centimeters square. Again, using these sculptures, these very free ways of making paintings. And I found it was interesting that if I started to make a painting of one of the sculptures, if something was going a bit wrong or I didn't like it, what the painting looked like, I could go back to the sculpture, reconfigure it, rephotograph it, and take that back into the painting. So it was that way of almost going beyond the optical. It was almost that I had a tacit, almost like a, what's the word? So I could actually grab things in the painting in a sense through this process, or kind of play with that notion, I think, for myself in the studio. Slide number 41. Again, playing with humor quite a lot. These, you can see there's a sort of a central form, which is these sort of beads that I got from a pound shop, just glued onto a sort of a mounded hill shape, and then along the outside you got these small little clay figures that I've made out of self-hardening clay. And there's sometimes people like John Travolta and I don't know who else is in there. Angelina Jolie and Brad Pitt are in there somewhere. I don't know who they are, but it didn't really matter. It was just a way into the painting. It was a way of creating something that, because of the flat finish of the surface, looked like it was very much intended, and there had to be some sort of story behind it, but then there was nothing that you could kind of grasp onto. And you're kind of somewhat left with the colour, but never the colour on its own. There's always this hinting question in the background. Slide number 42. Still playing with that same notion. You're getting slightly bigger in this. And slide number 43. Sort of pushing things right up against the surface of the painting, which is something that I've been doing a lot more recently, actually. Very shallow pictorial spaces. But sort of playing with like the actual stars in the background came from I Google searched stars, I'm sure, something like that, and up came sort of a digital computer generated version of that. And I quite liked that if you painted it, you'd never really know. So there was actually quite a lot of artificiality in it. But then if you I felt if I worked long enough at the painting, there'd be something more humane, or something that might kind of imply something more than irony in a painting. That's what I was kind of interested in. I quite like irony in paintings, but not on its own, not as a kind of a dead end. Right, I'll move on to, that was just before I came to the Slade School of Art. If you move to slide number 44, I again tried to push, right, what was the most important thing that I really liked working with in the paintings, because I'm very interested in filling paintings with things that I like, that I'm interested in making work about, as well as, I guess, ideas based. And I thought the way I was using acrylic was almost like joining little patches of painting together, and I thought it kind of resembled almost like how you would input information into woven images. So actually, when I was on my MFA at the Slade, we were very much encouraged to sort of, experiment and actually maybe not even make art. That was fine, as long as you were sort of not doing what you were doing. That was the important thing, that we were encouraged to do. And a lot of group work as well, a lot of group projects and print projects. So it was very liberating, and I ended up spending a year weaving, and I built a loom and I played around a lot with digital images, and I kind of didn't really make any work. But if you go on to slide number 45, I was trying to see could I make paintings that looked a bit like something that was woven. So this was made out of, I made a little stamp tool and kind of removed my hand a little bit and almost printed on these little dots of colour. And slide number 46, I was playing around with silk screening the background, so kind of a mesh, and then putting these sort of, trying to break down the actual sculptures that I was making. I was still making sculptures at the time, trying to break down the sculptures into sort of linear forms, almost like wire mesh models. And I was getting I was getting quite interested in, I guess, the theoretical side of painting at the time, but also kind of more heartfelt kind of interpretations of painting. This, if you look at slide number 47, I came across this essay by, or this play by Piet Mondrian, who a lot of you will know, but it's a play he wrote called Essay in Trialogue form, and it's basically an abstract painter, a figurative painter, and what he calls a layman, so someone who's not an artist, basically, walking through a landscape. I won't read it all out, but basically they stop at various points, kind of from dawn to dusk, and this is when they stop and look at the stars. And I thought I think I was reading, was it Kandinsky's From Point to Line to Plane, and I was reading that book Flatland as well, this kind of idea of very formal ideas in painting and how I couldn't reconcile that with painting today. And just the last paragraph I thought was quite interesting, quite beautiful, but kind of, it sort of keyed into things I was interested in, how I was making paintings. And Piet Mondrian, I think this is the abstract artist, looking at the stars in the sky, and he says, between 2 points, line plastically appears, and with more points, more lines. And this star-filled sky shows us innumerable points, unequally accentuated, one star shining more brightly than another, and their varying brightnesses once again creating forms. I just thought this was really interesting, the idea that when you looked up at something like this, the night sky, that was sort of, I guess in a sense, overwhelming, or almost, it was difficult to look at one thing without seeing everything else, that you do sort of, I guess, almost like a kind of horror zodiac signs, you do kind of join the dots a little bit. But I thought it was quite interesting in taking that into paintings, because I felt I really was, because acrylic is slow drying and the way that I would work was almost dividing the painting into sections. I was almost like, there almost were like these little dots the way I was constructing the paintings. And I was trying to think about how that kind of worked visually, I think, and kind of how we could manipulate that more. If we go to slide number 48, 49 and 50, these are some other things I was looking at. 48 is a illuminated manuscript. I was quite interested in them, and especially the way they hid humour inside in the margins of some of these manuscripts. Slide number 49, this is William Calf, very well-known still life painter, but the little cup in the painting is quite curious, because everything else can be accounted for through, they know, is the itinerary of what he had in his house, but the cup, it didn't exactly look like that. So he was able to create this, I guess, quite photographic scene, but then once he had sort of the main elements in it, the table and the carpet on the right, and the bowl and the glassware, the actual Nautilus cup, he was able to actually invent that almost out of his head, in a sense. It could kind of sit in there quite comfortably, but they know it actually didn't exist. And there was this idea that he was almost, was he in a sense interested in kind of adding sort of a supplementary value to something that's crafted, something that's so beautiful anyway? What can you do by making a painting of it? And that's something that I was quite interested in reading Norman Bryson's book about still life painting, and the idea of why do they make them at all, the kind of curious undercurrents to still life painting. And I was also looking at things like, this is Valerie Jondan from in slide number 50, this painting Union. This is from the pattern and decoration movement, kind of another under-celebrated movement in painting. This is 1981. A sort of almost like trying to acknowledge the craft of making painting and how that can be quite important. And I was very interested in the time of the narrative of the making of a painting and how that could become part of my processing. Slide number 51, 2 and 3 are paintings where I was trying to almost not overcomplicate my process, but kind of sort of see how far I could push one idea. So I was, as I was saying, I was making these woven cloths, just like two colors, very simple, with this loom that I'd made. Then I would scan them. I would select one tiny little section of the scanned cloth, and I would multiply it on Photoshop so that it was a digital image which looked like a very large woven cloth. I would then print that out. I would, so it was just an inkjet of that. I would wet it and I would stretch it and squelch it into a form, and then I would take a photograph of that form, and that photograph of the form was the little black and white images in the middle of these three paintings, 51, 52, and 53. And in the background, I've actually just run a brush, sort of a wide brush through with a small bit of brown paint and on top of a white primed surface, so that when I ran the brush down through it with some acrylic medium, every single brush, sort of every single hair in the brush kind of showed up. And I thought that was quite like a sort of a warp of something that's woven, and the way I was working with sort of my interest in tapestry and woven cloth. And then what I would do is, so I'd have these lines from the brush and I would pick in between each line with a small coloured line. And it was almost like an aimless kind of an activity. It was almost like filling time in a sense, or wasting time. So I was interested in having, I guess, different sort of attitudes to, I guess, time, or maybe even failure, like we were saying earlier, kind of having something of that in the painting without it slipping completely into irony. So that's where 51, 52, and 53 came from. Image number 54, these are the paintings that I actually had for my my degree show at the end of my MFA. And I had a kind of another kind of a aha moment where I was trying to make these paintings from Photoshop, which are of flat images that I was creating in Photoshop, kind of multicolored gradients. And I tried to make paintings of them and they never looked good. But then one time I had a projector in the studio and I projected it onto a little sculpture I was making out of plasticine. And I liked the way that the images I made on the computer could bend or wrap or add a surface to something like plasticine. It kind of colored it to a degree. So this painting number 54, slide number 54, if you go down to slide number 55, it's a close-up, and you can kind of imagine that these are lines of plasticine that I've just arranged on a board and then projected on a digital image onto it. And I would actually run it through, I was creating these sort of trippy psychedelic animations, and I would let them play and just keep taking photographs and come back a day later and sift through and try and find them in a sense. So I was definitely making them, but there was a part of my process which was sort of a kind of a gathering, a kind of a collecting of things. The animation just went on. It was just it was on sort of a it was doing its own thing. You could set it to this sort of to just sort of what's the word, sort of gestate away, or it would just sort of, it kind of was like almost like pools of water, and all these colors would just make themselves. I don't know how the actual program worked, but it gave me images that I found interesting to paint. Slide number 56. It's kind of the same again. This is just, it's almost like this is like a still from a sort of these pixels that were, I think it was just, I was projecting them onto something like cotton wool, but I like the way it almost looked like a head, sort of like a skull shape. So a lot of the things in this painting sort of do reference something, I guess, almost head-like to a degree, or kind of a sort of almost treating the painting in a sense, because of its scale. They're not large, they're not even half a meter high, most of them, that it does sort of relate to the head rather than to the body, which is something I was interested in. Slide number 57. I think I just like the balance in this painting, but it did come, if you look at slide number 58, it did come from just drawing, getting 8 or 9 markers, scribbling them all over an A4 page, and then splicing up the paper with a paper shredder. And then when I kind of scattered them on a scanner, I found that I get these interesting kind of curled loops. So I would use them on top of, which is quite hard to see in the background, these sort of procedurally made sort of drawings with stencils that I was making at the same time. I was trying to become a sort of a process painter, and I sort of failed, and I ended up putting these sort of detailed sort of paintings on top of them. So it's kind of, again, it was another way, an accidental way of clashing two languages together. Slide number 59. So oftentimes I was, if you look at slide number 59, the kind of, I guess I was interested in the kind of the sense of falling, or kind of scattering, or sort of floating down sort of little pockets of dense information. You can see it in slide number 60. But a lot of these were coming from things like images that didn't work over the 2 years, and I was at the Slade, and I would just, like, there's one of a kind of a looped magenta line on top of a something I made on Photoshop. But then when I cut it out and I scanned that again, I found that the scanner kind of bleached it out slightly, and I found that a much more interesting image to paint from. Slide number 61. Flames on a sort of a multicolored ticker tape. So I was sort of interested in the idea of the inputting, the time you put into a painting and how it doesn't necessarily sort of line up with the time that comes out of, I guess, in viewing a painting. That's something I was quite interested in. So the flame is something that is sort of, in a sense, something that sort of, I guess, burning itself out to a degree, a kind of a limited amount of time, but then something in a painting which is sort of timeless in the sense that it's sort of, it never shifts or changes. So I was quite interested in a very broad sense in how, in sort of how time kind of underpins or kind of interlocks into a painting. Slide number 63. I'll just come on to some kind of more recent work that I've been doing. After I finished at my MA, I kind of did the same thing again, where I was trying to figure out what exactly do I want to do, what are the kind of paintings that I really want to make, rather than the paintings that I feel that I could make, and that what would I be challenged by. And because I always knew that if I did this sort of method of working was always a way of kind of separating what I wasn't that much interested in and kind of taking something forward or foregrounding it. And I started making these paintings of branches, very, very simple, but I was allowing myself to not so much copy the photograph, but to just almost like follow the line drawing and then let the photograph go and just sort of see how far I could get on my own to a degree, just with the materials. And I ended up kind of making them almost look like they were sort of combined of hundreds of these kind of bubbles with little specular highlights on them. And that was something that I was quite interested in pushing forward. If I show you some more recent work in a minute. Slide number, I'll just show you some images of kind of the way that I make paintings now, very much the actual sort of in the studio, and how I actually come up with, I guess, go from very simple ideas to things that I guess are simple in another way, maybe interwoven with certain kind of complex ideas about looking. But this slide number 64 is an image from a sketchbook that I kept that was just to sort of give me ideas of what to make paintings about. If you see the left-hand page, there's a small little note which says make mountains and clouds. It's sort of on the right-hand side of the left-hand page. That was enough to make a painting out of. That was something that started a painting that I'll come on to. So I would sort of write mountain and clouds. That's something, that'd be kind of a strange thing to make a painting about. How can I go at something that almost feels like it's about completely going to collapse and fail? And I started collecting images of things like from the internet as well. So I was trying to kind of gather in all the different ways I was working over the last few years. And these are images of droplets of water from the internet. And number 66, slide number 66, is an image of my studio at the time, this sort of conglomerate sort of sculpture with plants in it and broken old sculptures all kind of smashed together. Slide number 67 is a sort of a digital animation I'd made. This is a still from it that I would project this onto the sculptures as well. And slide number 68, this is the painting that I ended up making at that time. So it went from sort of, I think, mountain and clouds to this sort of painting of looking almost like a thicket. So yeah, what I was trying to do was sort of cram in as much as I could, really. I just wanted to make sort of paintings that you couldn't focus on anything. You had to sort of, in a sense, fragment it or cut it up in order to get into it, really. Image number 69. So it's got things like flames that I'd used before and small little sculptures mixed with plants. So each sort of, everything is sort of diluted by everything else. And that's something I was quite interested in. There's still elements of humor. If you go to slide number 70, there's these little eyes that are hiding in the darkness that you can't see when you're far away. But when you come closer, it's almost as if there's a sort of, as if some characters inside this thicket have sort of made the thicket itself. I was sort of hinting at something like that. And that they're almost skulking away from your look, from your gaze when you come closer to the painting. So that the painting changed in different viewing distances. Slide number 71 is another close-up. So I quite liked how you could, it was almost like a series of paintings kind of combined together. Slide number the next number of slides from 72 to 75 are just things that I've been looking at recently. Richard Est's paintings of this painting, a double self-portrait where he's painted himself reflected in a window of a shop, an almost impossible superimposition. I was quite interested in that, sort of how you could make a painting about that. Where does that put you as a viewer in front of the painting? Same sort of thing with, strangely enough, with Francisco de Zuberan's paintings of still lives, where he's lined them all up in the same sort of distance from the viewer, from the picture plane, and with the black background, it's almost like it's coming out into our space, that there's a sense of a sort of a blocking out of the vanishing point, which sort of, in a sense, inverts our sort of look at the painting, where it kind of bounces back off. There's nothing for us to sort of land on, in a sense, and it sort of makes us, in a sense, into the vanishing point. If you read people like Jacques Lacan, the idea of the sort of the gaze in painting as something that kind of upsets our sort of, I guess, what's the word, sort of monocentric or sort of Cartesian sense of kind of being in the center of the world. It's sort of a slightly implied undercurrent that I've read into sort of paintings like this Zubran painting. Max Ernst, his jungle paintings, and I've been looking a lot at Richard Dad as well when I was making that last painting. Things hiding in the undergrowth. And going back to the gaze again with slide number 75, this is Jan van Eyck's The Annunciation diptych, and if you can just about see that black mirrored surface behind the two Trompe-l'oeil angels, and in a sense that's reflecting the backs of the sculptures that are painted, but then that's kind of reflecting our space. I think it's quite, I like the idea of mirrors in painting. It's something that I've been looking at, and how that sort of, in a sense, disrupts our space of viewing. Slides number 76 onwards, these are just some small watercolors that I've been making alongside making the large paintings, because the last painting took about 7 months to paint, and the next painting I'm going to show you took about 1.5 years, and I found I had to kind of, in a sense, a bit like the older sort of bad paintings on cartridge paper, I had to kind of break out a little bit. So this was a way of understanding smaller relationships within the paintings and exploring them. So slides number 76 and 77, and I started to add a lot more specular highlights to these. These are just small little clay sculptures I made, but they were covered in varnish, and I liked the way that light would play off them, and I started adding in my own little specular highlights, so they became quite bleached out. And if you go to slide number 79, this painting was sort of a combination of certain things about adding those sort of glowing bits of light, and I like that actually the light in the painting, in a sense, can be implied as being the light of your space of viewing. And I like the way that if I added more specular highlights than were there actually in the image that I was painting, it could be said that, well, it's kind of something I'm working on at the moment in my research, the way that that when you stand back from the painting from a distance of a few feet, you can't really see the highlights, but if you go closer, they kind of start to become something more visible. So that I like the idea of kind of playing with sort of, you can have very, very different, you can have one painting, but it can do very, very different things at different viewing distances and imply very different things, or even, in a sense, looking like it's reflecting the light of your space of viewing, but actually looking like it mirrors that space as well, sort of very subliminally. Slides number 80 onwards are some close-ups, and also I'm quite interested in the idea of the gesture, and that kind of returning to the kind of a free gesture, and I found a place for myself to return to it as at a very proximal, close distance to the surface of the painting. So a lot of these white marks are sort of made up, but with the representational scheme that I'm kind of working through or working from the photograph, I can kind of get away with it. So I'm trying to do two things at the same time to a degree. In slide number 81, I'm hiding all sorts of images like keyholes and metal reflective leaves and small orbs and planets. Slide number 82, almost adding so many highlights that you can't see anything at all, but then all these images feel very close to the painting's surface, almost coming at you to a degree, so you can't kind of look through into the painting like a landscape. You're kind of blocked by it to a degree. I'm quite interested in that kind of disrupting of your sort of kind of a longer gaze, in a sense, a more in-depth gaze. And slide number 83 is the last image. So sort of, yeah, that's sort of a close-up of the same painting. And still there's like small little puffs of smoke just going off into the middle on the left, which was sort of hinting that there's something happening in the painting, or someone has put this together, that again kind of going back to the narrative of making the painting again. So that's it. That's the end.
Thank you, Donal. That's great. Thank you very much. Wow. Lots to think about and lots to look at. And you're happy to take any questions, yeah?
Yes. Yeah, no problem.
Okay. So, wow. Yeah, amazing. Absolutely. Anybody got anything they want to ask?
Hi Donal.
Hello.
Hi. I'm quite interested in the way you move back and forwards with the image and photography, etc., etc. And I'm fascinated by why you keep painting. Was there never a point you wanted to just collage some of the images into your finished work rather than actually painting them in as well?
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. Or some people have asked as well, why don't I show the sculptures or both of them together? Or why does it always have to end up being painting? If your practice could be so free, or you can do anything. We don't have rules anymore in making art. Then why do I end up doing that sort of thing? And I think I really like a sort of a very slow gestational sort of way of painting, really. So it is sort of procedural to a degree. I am working from images, but I would only start the painting with a small image, maybe just off center, and just kind of grow the painting that way. But I've even thought recently, why don't I just screen print on the underpainting, because they're underpainted in sort of brown tones, and then I glaze and glaze and glaze the colors on top. I just love that very sort of intimate, slow way of working. And I thought that if I sort of, as you said, just stuck on the images, I found that I lose that sort of unity over something of the space, that then I can't. To be honest, I think I should try it but my sort of inkling is that it wouldn't sort of hold together in the same way.
Yeah.
Does that answer the question, sort of?
Yeah. I was just fascinated in your process and why you were making that, those decisions. So yes, thank you. You've answered. Yeah, great.
Okay.
Donal, there's a question in the chat box there from Jen from America.
Oh, yes.
She's saying, have you ever considered weaving your own painting canvas?
I actually, when I was building a loom and doing all that, that was actually my intention. I thought I'd kind of caught onto something. I was like, oh, there's no one making. I know Rosemary Trockle was making sort of woven sort of paintings, but I was thinking, wow, wouldn't it be interesting to do that and to paint on perspex on top of it? And it's always something in the back of my mind. I thought it was an interesting, but actually I realized that I love that sort of single representational space. Whilst I do like the idea, if you weave something, you're kind of doing surface and support at the same time. A bit like that Morris Lewis staining of color. I love that idea, but I've sort of played around with it a little bit and done some really awful, terrible experiments. But then I've ended up smashing them together to become sort of sculptures. So in a roundabout way, I kind of got it in.
Any other questions for Donal?
I can see Jennifer's comment there. I could stain each individual thread. Yeah, no, that's a good point. It's actually, I realize how difficult it actually is to do something that's not kind of patterned, and to work with tapestry. I went to see the reproduction of the unicorn tapestries down in West Dean in Sussex, and I walked into a room with people who've been doing it for 18 months, and there was about 9 or 10 of them, and it was just mind-boggling. And they're literally doing that, building it like building pixel by pixel. Yeah.
I'm not saying that you should, spend your entire time with the woven structure, but
Yeah.
there are definitely other ways to get around, setting up your weave structure so that, maybe the base is dip dyed somehow where you're not having to like pull out each thread and stain it individually. Maybe it's like that sort of process where the thread sucks up the color on its own or something. I don't know.
Yeah, I'll have to give myself the opportunity to to kind of play around with that. That's the tricky thing, isn't it? When you kind of have so many things you sort of love to kind of get around. I guess the way that I've been kind of working in a sense has allowed me to kind of dip in without feeling. I think I felt that when I was with the tapestry, because I kind of got to a point where I felt, well, why don't I just go off and just do this properly? And I realized that actually it's kind of, it's not doing anything in particularly properly, which gives me a kind of a sense of freedom to a degree. But yeah, I'm one of these people who always loves picking up these sort of kids craft books and just looking at those very simple sort of sculptural ways of putting colors together. I often find it's difficult to kind of beat that sort of sense, but I find I need to push it through painting then, in a sense, to sort of fit some of those bits together. Maybe it might be something about resolving something, I'm not sure.
Debjani, I have to say that a couple of times during Donal's presentation, thinking about all of you on the course, I was thinking about your work and your paper cutting and your intricate layering, and I wondered whether you felt there was any sort of resonance between the way that you work and what we've seen of Donal's work this evening.
Yeah, definitely. I think it was very interesting for me because how I'm looking for more randomness in my work. Even my work is like a collage of paper cuts. I'm trying to make it very disjointed, but it shouldn't be coherent, and I'm trying to get inspiration from you because yours is very disjointed, and it's it's very disguised, and you really don't know what it is, and that's what it shouldn't have a narrative. Like, it should be really open-ended. So I think it's a lot of practice I can see to achieve that, because to create a randomness, it's very orchestrated randomness. I mean, to achieve that. So, yeah, I felt it was very similar because it's like collage. And I was wondering if you have in the end, do you find meaning in your work, or are you trying to say something, or is it just very open-ended even for yourself, or does it mean anything to you when you complete a piece?
Yeah, it does, but I sort of suspend there needing to be a sort of a reason for making, because I mean I've done the whole thing, and I'm sure some of you who are maybe making paintings or sort of making something very particular, like you could be just making video and very much trying to get to grips with the sort of the specifics of the medium. And I found I tied myself up in knots. I read up all about modernist painting and sort of critiques of that, and trying to find, like, it's so easy to find ways not to do something. And I found the one way, and I always found was something, I guess, quite playful, or suspending a reason for making the work and just saying, I'm just going to start it, and I'm going to put one thing over another and take away something else and go with that. And I mean, sometimes it was about just saying, right, I'm going to sit in the studio for 8 hours and I'm not going to stop making work until I finish, and time limits. Because I found when I used to do life drawing when I was younger, when the tutor would give you 30 seconds or give you 2 minutes to make a work, you sort of made things that you'd never make without those kind of limits, very productive limits. And you could be quite playful, because in a sense you were the limit, in a sense, had made the work with you, not just yourself. It was sort of away from, I guess it's kind of like a mental thing, isn't it? It's kind of a way of tricking yourself into doing something. And then, but I found that it's just meant that I've had to stop at certain times and, well, what is this looking like? And right, I was trying to paint the view from inside a cave looking out at mountains. That was the last painting I showed. That was kind of the idea, but it's kind of a strange thing to make a painting about. And I knew in the back of my mind that it was never going to look like that. But if I went at something quite specific, I could sort of see it kind of change course, and I could sort of go with that then. And, you know, I guess we're all kind of viewers of our own work as it's kind of happening at the same time. And that's, you know, in some ways that makes it more difficult. Yeah, I'm not sure if I kind of answered your question, but I sort of go back into the painting at different points, especially at the end, and then I get the feeling, I don't want to say it's intuitive, but it sort of is that, you know, you stand back from it, you get that visual jolt or whatever, and then you say, right, I'll do something else. But it's sometimes it takes me quite a while to figure out what the painting could be doing. There's a lot of I'm much more interested in sort of elements of doubt and elements of uncertainty in, but not just like that, just saying, oh, my work's about uncertainty, or my work's about, you know, anyone can bring their own their kind of experiences. I think that's important, but it's kind of a given, and it's kind of just like, you know, I think it's about knowing what type of uncertainty is in an artwork, you know. Someone like Marlene Dumas, the way that she sort of slips uncertainty in there, and it's almost like you're looking at the painting and you're starting to go off into your own sort of personal sort of recollections and trying to project them onto the painting, but you always get a feeling that she kind of knows you were going to go that particular way. There's a sort of an orchestration, a sort of a very delicate sort of an orchestration that I think can is more part of works, I think, that are uncertain than kind of often meets the eye, I think.
Thank you very much.
No problem.
Probably got time for one more question.
That's fine.
Hello, Donal.
Hello.
It's Ian here. I am amazed at all the detail and intricate work that you've done there. Have you had any of these paintings published? You know, I'm thinking like, you know, Peter Blake's album work. That and it seems similar, you know, with the way they're using plasticine. And I mean, I don't know if you remember when he did the Brit Awards, and I can imagine if you were doing one, it would be made out of plasticine with lacquered, and you know, in that kind of form.
Yeah. No, I've never had anything published. Like, I think one painting someone used for an album, some Irish group, I can't remember who they were, but I think it could be quite interesting. I feel like sometimes I just trying to think about you know, your reasons for getting into art and that sort of thing. And I remember being about 17 and realizing that you could just put a CD on, and it was a great way to listen to music. And I wonder, have I kind of wrapped art around that sort of thing, because I love listening to music, and it's something. I think there's often interesting crossovers between what people listen to and what people like looking at, kind of the attitudes within sort of those two forms. But other than that, no, I haven't had anything published.
Okay, yeah, it just I don't know why I thought that commercial side. I could imagine this on a Frank Zappa album.
I actually love Frank Zappa.
Yeah, and I'm sure he did a movie to go with one, not a movie, a video to go with one of his. It's showing my age here, the old grey whistle test. And it was all the plasticine people. I don't know if you. And it was just a great video to go with his music. So I just thought there was similarities there. But thanks anyway.
Thank you.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Donal. There's just one other comment I'll just read out. I don't know whether you saw it. Alex saying that she loved your process. The process seems like a performance.
Ah, it's a good point. Yeah. Because I actually gave a talk once, and a few years ago, and someone said, you know, they weren't at all interested in the paintings. They were interested in they said, I prefer to see, you know, a video of you making them, But I think that really keys into something that kind of crept up on me a couple of years ago. And I think I gave a talk somewhere, I think Wolverhampton, and someone said about this idea of there's a slight narrative in your painting, but actually there's an overwhelming narrative of the making of the painting, which is sort of, it's everywhere. You can't look at the work without seeing it, the surface and the layering and the glazing, and in a sense that it's almost like I've been reading quite a lot recently about trompe l'oeil painting, where they would paint things that were kind of cast aside, husks of fruit and scraps of things, and that there was no narrative in them. In a sense, the viewer sort of took the place of that narrative, which is quite a curious sort of thing. I don't think it's the only thing that happens. I do think it might be part of the work, that it is sort of like a hidden performance, and that the artwork could be a sort of a relic or a kind of leftoverness or something to the performance, or to the artwork. Yeah, it's something I get the feeling of whenever I stand in front of an artwork that looks like, even like an Alexis Harding, where it looks like it's taken time in a very different sense, and more of a dripping or a kind of a falling material sense, but that you get the sense that his look is there all the time. Or was it I'm trying to remember the name of the artist who made that piece called 1,000 Hours Staring at a Blank Sheet of Paper. And that's all the artwork is. It's just hung up on the wall, blank sheet of paper. Can't remember, an American artist, and that was it. But you do get this aura or something from even a work like that, which has nothing but the look. So yeah, it's an interesting point. It's something I haven't figured out, but then again, I'm kind of getting more sort of at ease with not figuring things out completely in the work. I think matching what, kind of what I make with an exact theory, I think it's much more interesting the way that it's sort of a compound of things. And it's, I guess for me, it's about, I like that kind of trying to tease it out, but probably thinking it's probably best to tease it out by making another painting. I find that's the way that I've tried to kind of approach research and practice.
I think that's a really good point to finish on. Thank you very, very much. I found it really fascinating, and I'm sure everybody else did. Well, I know they did from the comments there. So thank you, everybody. It's been a very full session, but lots of things to think about. I will see you on the 8th, but I will be sending you emails just to summarise PPP and statements for that. And then after that, I think the next session is a critique of work with Angela, which would be great to look forward to. Have a good Easter holiday, those of you too who are taking some time off. And Donal, if you just want to stay online for a minute, and yep. Everybody else, as this second section of this evening has been recorded, and it will be available in about 24 hours, and it will be up there for 7 days. So if you want to listen again, you're able to. And obviously for Judith, who hasn't been able to make it this evening, it'd be great because she won't miss that. Judith, by the way, Donal is an abstract painter, so I'm really glad we were able to record the session for her. So thanks everybody, and speak to you all very soon. Bye now.